Okay, before we all start mouthing off about the situation in Korea, the danger of a wider war, I would suggest that that you look up, at the very least, on a rudimentary level, the actual history of that country. Now, most of what we know about South Korea and North Korea is the story of the Korean War. But you have to go back much further, at least to the Yalta Conference after the Second World War, or at the end of the Second World War, and how that country was divided up between the various regional powers and superpowers, then progressing into the Cold War and so on. So without understanding that, we can't even begin to talk, basically. Like most Western people, I believe for a very long time that, needless to say, North Korea is an autocratic regime, they're dictatorial, and so on. But I've been researching this for quite some time, and so it's not a black and white situation here. Basically, the United States government, and this is not known to many people here in America, has done their very best to also support autocratic and dictatorial regimes in South Korea. The United States government was involved in propping up a dictatorial regime right after the Korean War in South Korea, and this progressed from there, taking turns between more democratically minded governments and another military coup and so on. But rest assured, the United States did not stand up for democracy in South Korea. In fact, they did the exact opposite. And if you don't believe me, you can look up the entire history in the National Archives, because of the declassified documents that are posited there, which make it unmistakably clear that the United States was actually involved in suppressing democratic movements in South Korea. This all took place, during the 1980s. The first somewhat democratically elected government came into power sometime later. The power factions actually gave up their power to a viable opposition, and it was the first time that has ever happened actually in South Korea, and that's that happened 20 years ago, over 20 years ago. And since then, the undemocratic forces have been pushing back hard, getting hardliners back in power, essentially. And so it's a difficult situation, because the Korean people as a whole are being used as pawns, essentially. They always have been for a very long time. The Russians and the Chinese are not innocent in this by any means. But you also need to consider the U.S. role in all of this, because democratic movements were crushed in South Korea for more than 30 years, until people had had enough in South Korea and they made their voices known. And so one of their governments established what they called a sunshine policy. I'm not going to get involved in too many names, you know, Kim this, Kim Young, Kim whatever, okay? You can read this on your own, I'm sure. But the fact remains that Western powers were not happy when democracy or the people demanded something in South Korea. What they were interested in was to set up multinational corporations, and to some degree, yes, of course, that raised living standards for quite a few people in South Korea. But again, this rising of the middle class can only go so far, because as soon as the middle class demands a little more, then they are regarded as the enemy. So think about that in terms of what's happening in South Korea and the provocations by the South Korean government, which is pretty hardline at this point. It's basically along the same lines that Bush was promoting. And the United States government is not opposing this. They are, in fact, complicit with these provocations. And it's not that the situation is completely explosive, okay? China, on the other hand, should not be dismissed because they have some leverage. But as usual, you need to remember that the Koreans, the Korean people, are used as pawns. Just like most of us here. And as propaganda is so effective, people will be pitted against each other as usual, you know. So this same situation is taking place in Korea. So I just want to remind you that this situation is not the good guys against the bad guys in North Korea. Rest assured, the South Korean government is just as corrupt as the North Koreans. And it's the people, you know, it's the people who pay the price in the end. Good night.